Thank you very much, Amanda, for that too kind introduction. It's the first time I think Nikki and I have been described as a power couple. We'll take any compliments coming our way. And good morning to everybody, and thank you everybody for coming and indeed for tuning in online. I hope all the technology is working so you can hear and see me. I must remember not to stand too close to the screen, otherwise we'll only have a nice view of the neck downwards. So Amanda's already said what I'm going to talk about. I mean, the church is a peculiar English institution, but a very important one. And for understanding how England works and the culture of it, there's no better place one of the interesting places to start is the church. And as Amanda said, I'll talk briefly about the history. I'll describe the Church of England as it is today. And I'll also touch at the end, thirdly, on some of the challenges that it faces, and it certainly does face some challenges. But let's start with the Queen, always a good place to start. And here is the Queen in Westminster Abbey in 1953, her coronation, with on the left, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, in all her regalia. And among her many titles, as Amanda has said, that she is, so to speak, sworn in at the coronation, is Supreme Governor of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. So this might strike you who are new to this country as pretty odd. What is the what's going on? In most countries, the church and the state and the government are completely separate, certainly in France, for example. Why is England different? Well, for that, we have to go back a bit into some history. And here is St. Augustine. St. Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with St. Augustine of Hippo, as an MBS member who pointed out the confusion last time I gave this talk, for which I'm very grateful. I now know a lot more about it, or a bit more about it anyway. So Augustine was sent by the Pope in Rome, Pope Gregory, and arrived in Kent on the south coast in 597. And this was part of the Pope's project to spread Christianity far and wide. This is a slightly busy map, but if you look at the dark purple areas, that's where Christianity was starting from the year of Christ's death onwards. And it was spreading a bit in southern Europe mainly. And it took about almost 600 years to get up to where we are here in England. At any rate, he landed, St. Augustine landed in Kent. There was no United Kingdom then, of course, but there was a king of Kent who received him politely, a bit cautiously, and allowed him to set up a church in Canterbury. And eventually the king converted to Christianity, and eventually the whole country followed. And ever since then, the church was set up in Canterbury, and ever since then, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury who has been head of the Church of England. And for the next 900 years, that was how things were. The Pope in Rome ruling the church far and wide, and including England, which was under the authority of the Pope. So what happened then? Well, this happened. Now, wait a minute. For visitors only, who is that? Who is that rather imposing figure on the left? Does anybody know? Can anyone tell me who that is? Historical figure. A king, yes. Which king? Henry. Excellent. Henry, quite a common name for kings in England. This is Yates. And Henry VIII is mainly famous for having had 6 wives, which is quite something. And the reason he had more than one wife, he was actually quite a devoted husband in his way, I'm told. I hope if there are any historians here, they can put us right. But Henry, of course, at the time, his one aim in life was to have a son. So the only way to assure your succession in these troubled times was to have a son. And Catherine of Aragon, the first one, to whom he was otherwise devoted, we're told, couldn't produce a son. She produced a daughter, who later became a queen, but never mind. And so Henry wanted to annul the marriage, not divorce, because that wasn't allowed, but annul the marriage. In other words, he wanted the Pope to say, okay, I agree, your marriage was null and void. It was never really a marriage from the beginning, and you can marry whoever you like. Because meanwhile, he'd fallen in love with the next one, Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused, and led to some difficulty, because after long negotiations, the Pope decided to excommunicate Henry, but Henry, in any case, decided that he was going to break with Rome and have his own church in England. And no doubt one of the motives for doing that was that the church was an extremely rich institution at the time. In fact, that was one of the problems. And a brief background, I mean, all over Europe, you may have heard of Martin Luther, all over Europe, there was a reformation going on to protest against the authority of Rome, and the Catholic Church had then become extremely corrupt. So Henry wasn't alone in breaking away from Rome, but he did this in a rather dramatic way. So he confiscated all the church property and declared himself head of the Church of England. Oh, right, it's switched on a bit. Yeah, just like that, no problem. So, I needn't say any more about the history. If you want to know more about the 6 wives, an easy way to remember what happened to them, it's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And between them they produced 1 son and 2 daughters, all of whom became monarchs in due course, but that's for another time. So that's a bit of the history, how the Church of England was set up and why. Let's move on to the Church of England today. Well, it's under the authority of 2 archbishops. I'm sure you'll recognize this one, Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. Here he is presiding at the wedding of Harry and Meghan Markle in happier times at the Queen's Chapel, Queen's private chapel in Windsor. And the other Archbishop is Stephen Cotterill, seen here with a rather outsized staff. This is the bishop's crozier. If you look very carefully, you can see it's roughly the same design as something that's designed by a shepherd to corral the sheep. This is the idea. Christians are all sheep and they're guided by the shepherd, who is the bishop. Anyway, so here is Stephen Cotterill, appointed a couple of years ago in July, and I was involved in this appointment as the Prime Minister's appointment secretary in York. And the way that it's set up is that there are 2 provinces of the Church of England. We're only talking about England here. Ireland, Wales, and so on have their own churches. Scotland also. So Archbishop of York presides over the bits in red, the north, and the Archbishop of Canterbury presides over the southern province in the south. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, is in charge of the whole thing. You can see the south is rather larger. So there are 42 dioceses, as they're called, districts of the church in all, of which 14, I think, are in the north and 28 in the south. So if you can see here, you can see where we are. We are in the Diocese of Ely, just to the left of Norwich there. And here is Ely Cathedral. And if you're a visiting scholar, and if you visit no other church in this region, then Ely Cathedral is the one you must visit. It's a magnificent building. And Ely is presided over by a bishop, because every diocese is presided over by a bishop. And the bishop will have 1 or more suffragan bishops. So suffragan means junior bishop, deputy bishop. In the case of our diocese here in Ely, that suffragan bishop is in Huntington. And then you have, I won't go into the sort of full hierarchy, though you can ask me about it afterwards if you're very interested. But you then have at the parish level, a parish church with either a vicar or a rector in charge, and then the most junior rank are called curates. So if you come across rector, vicar, curates, you'll probably recognize them anyway as being of the church, but they will be members of the priests in the church. So that's how the church is organized. Some of the peculiarities are, and not many people know this, that the church has its own parliament. It's called the General Synod. And the General Synod passes its own laws. So there's a whole corpus of laws, nothing to do with legislation passed by the House of Commons, passed by this body, which is then, the laws that passed had to be approved by by Parliament and the Queen, as they usually are. And it's made up of a House of Bishops and then elected members of the House of Clergy and the House of Laity. Again, you don't want too much detail, but just to note that there is a separate Parliament passing separate laws in the Church of England, which is another peculiarity. One of the laws they finally got around to passing in 1994 was to allow women to be bishops. This was a very difficult decision. Sorry, they only allowed women in 1994 to become priests, never mind bishops. It took until a lot later, in fact, after I had started the job as Prime Minister's Appointment Secretary in 2014, so only 7 years ago, they allowed women to become bishops. And this was the first woman bishop appointed, Libby Lane, then a suffragan bishop, seen there with the then Archbishop of York, Centenary. And Libby Lane is now Bishop of Derby. So there has been some progress, but that's just to underline what a very old-fashioned institution Church of England is. There are now today 25 women bishops out of a total of 108. So there is progress, but still a little way to go. Other parts of the Anglican Communion, which I'll touch on in a moment, other parts got there rather sooner, places like Ireland, even America, certainly very early on, New Zealand, all managed to agree that women could become bishops a lot sooner than England did. But anyway, it was finally done. Now, there's another peculiarity it's worth touching on, which is House of Lords. Here is a snapshot of the dynamic House of Lords. With a serried rank, you can see, of bishops. That's yes, Christine Hardman, the Bishop of Newcastle, on her feet. So what on earth is happening here? What are bishops doing unelected in the House of Lords? Well, it goes back to Henry VIII and Church and state being very closely bound together. The Church has the right, Church of England has the right, no other churches, Church of England has the right to appoint 26 bishops to the House of Lords, and they take a full part in legislation, and they can be very vocal, as we'll hear from time to time, on subjects such as euthanasia, assisted dying, as it's spoken of now, that they take a very strong view against, but on other sort of social issues in particular. So the government of the day has a hand in appointing all bishops and some deans of cathedrals. So I should have mentioned a cathedral, like the Ely Cathedral I showed you, is looked after by a dean, so you may hear that expression as well, the dean of a cathedral. Prime Minister's Appointment Secretary, as I was for 6 years, has a hand in the selection process. You go out to a diocese, have consultations with the great and good from all sides, outside the church as well as inside the church. And then it comes to a Crown Nominations Commission made up of 6 lay and 6 clergy people. There are interviews. Yes, even bishops are interviewed for the job, and eventually the appointment is made. The appointment is made by myself as Prime Minister's Appointment Secretary, writing to the Prime Minister saying, right, here is the proposal for the new bishop, and he approves it and then sends it on to the Queen, who also then has to approve it before the appointment can be made. Until 2004, the custom was the Prime Minister was given a choice of 2 names, and it has been said that on occasions the Prime Minister of the day chose the second name rather than the first name, much to the dismay of the Church. But that is no longer possible. Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister, swept away all of that legislation, and now there's just one name goes to the Prime Minister and to the Queen, and is invariably accepted. So one other peculiarity to bear in mind about the Church of England is that the Archbishop of Canterbury is the informal, I stress informal, head of the Anglican Communion. And the Anglican Communion, which was created about 150 years ago, brings together all the Anglican churches around the world. And they are scattered across something like 160 countries, about 85 million members. I'm not sure how they make that calculation, but sounds impressive. The 3rd largest Christian group, so behind the Roman Catholics and a few others. But it's an important organization. It has no formal role, informal legislative role. It can't pass laws. but it gets together every so often. This was the last Lambeth Conference in 2008. The serried ranks of bishops. There must be a collective noun for bishops. I'm not sure what it is, but very impressive. As I say, these conferences happen roughly every 10 years. So there was due to be another one. It was due to take place in 2020, but because of COVID, it's been delayed and should take place next year, 2022. As I said, it has no formal legislative powers to decide what doctrine should be, but there are some difficult issues lying ahead for them, as we'll come on to in a moment. So that's the church at its highest level. What about here in Cambridge? Now, here's another test to keep you awake. Here are 4 churches chosen much at random in Cambridge. And how many of you, again, let's look at the visitors. Can you, well, that one on the top left, that should be a fairly easy one. Anyone recognize? Grace and Mary's, exactly, the University Church. And if you want a good view on a fine day like today of Cambridge, then climb up the tower. I'm sure that's where you take people at regular intervals, or send them up the tower, perhaps. This is an interesting one. It's the Lepers' Chapel, the Leper Chapel, or I think it's technically called the Chapel of Centenary, Magdalene. It's one of the oldest buildings in Cambridge, 12th century. It was originally, it has a name, Leper Chapel. Leprosy, of course, was a disease, infectious disease. People were very frightened of and had to isolate people. How is that familiar? It's in the rather unglamorous part of Cambridge. If you go out towards the football stadium and sort of look to the left, just before you get there, you'll see it sitting in the middle of a field. But an important medieval building and worth a visit. And bottom left, anyone recognize that? I'll give you a clue. It's a college chapel. No, Jesus, yes, Jesus College, well done. Chosen at random, of course. Nikki, my wife, has a very close connection. Her father was a donor to Jesus many years. And it's a very beautiful chapel, every college except Newnham has a chapel, and many of them are well worth visiting, not least for choral evensong. If you like singing, like listening to singing in a chapel, then during term time, choral evensongs, most evenings of the week in one or more college chapels is a good way to visit historic bits of Cambridge and also listen to some beautiful music. And then this last one, maybe a bit more difficult, although it is very, very much in central Cambridge. I'm sorry? No, it's actually called, you're in the right area of town. It's next to the Arts Theatre, between the Arts Theatre and the Market Square. St Edward, yes, exactly. Or to give its full title, the Church of St Edward, King and Martyr. And the interesting thing about this, apart from being an interesting 13th century church, is that it's what's called a royal peculiar. A royal peculiar, as the name might suggest, means that it is under the direct authority of the Queen. It's not part of the formal structure that I've described of the Diocese of Ely. So the Bishop of Ely has no say in what happens in this church or the appointment of its vicar. Only the Queen has that authority. So that's another peculiarity. Right, well, let me finally move on to the future. What about the future of the church? Well, there are some challenges, and here are some of them. First, fewer and fewer people go to church. And that's partly because only 38%, and that was a few years ago, I think, the latest inquiry may come out with an even lower figure. Only 38% of the population in England identify as Christian. And not many of those actually go to church. And one of the reasons, perhaps, is because the church is seen as being rather out of touch with modern society on issues such as sex and gender. So same-sex marriage, so you can still not have even a blessing of a same-sex marriage in the Church of England. And of course, there's been a great growth of other faiths in England over the last few decades. And something rumoured, may just be no more than that, is whether the new king, eventually, King Charles, will want to keep the established church, or whether he'll want to be known as, instead of the defender of the faith, defender of the faiths, to underline the fact that there are many faiths now in British society which need to be represented. And if you manage to do that, then that would involve, this is a very useful word. If you're a Scrabble fan, actually probably too long for that, isn't it? Disestablishmentarianism is the longest word in the English language. At least always used to be. Maybe a longer word now, but this is a very useful word to impress your friends with. Disestablishmentarianism would mean complete separation of church and state. So meanwhile, one way the church is trying to maintain its reach and maintain its relevance is to get out of beautiful but sometimes rather intimidating churches and create a more welcoming environment. And Cafe Church is one of those examples. There's an example in the middle of Cambridge of that, where people just come in and think they're going to a cafe, and actually, they can get a bit of spiritual nourishment at the same time. The motto of the Church of England is a Christian presence in every community, but that doesn't have to be in the form of a church. In other parts of the country, the church is actually now often the only institution left standing, the only community institution left, because the post office and the pub and even the school and the doctor's surgery halls were moved away or closed, and the church is the only focal point for the community. And so the church has reacted by setting up food banks and post office sometimes, and other community facilities in church premises. So you will see more of that. So the thoughts of cafe brings us finally to the church and food. So this is a nice note to finish on. So for those of you who are visitors, look out next spring for Pancake Day. Pancakes mark the last day in the Christian calendar before Lent. Lent is a fasting period of 6 weeks before Easter, which is the great festival of Christianity. And then hot cross buns there. So the cross represents the crucifixion of Christ. And those are eaten on Good Friday traditionally, at the end of Lent, end of the fasting period, just before Easter. And then bottom right, this is a Christmas pudding, treat in store for those who've not yet sampled it. And this is the time of year, actually right now, well, later this month, 21st of November, I think, in the Christian calendar, Stir Up Sunday. This is the time when traditionally you get all your beautiful fruit and other stuff, including brandy and something to put it all together into a pudding well ahead of Christmas, because it has to mature and get really flavoursome. And then you bring it out on Christmas Day, pour some more brandy on it and set it alight. Not everyone's taste, but you should at least taste it once. So it's full of fruit and spices, as I say. So I think that's a good note to end on, the church and food. And so I've given you a brief summary, the history, the current state, some of the peculiarities, and the challenges that the church faces in the future. Thank you very much, both those online and those